Throughout the early 1940s, the gears of global conflict turned upon a single, viscous commodity flowing from the deep earth of Romania. Within a 6-mile ring surrounding the industrial town of Ploesti, a massive complex of oil refineries pulsed as the vital energy source for the German military machine. Every rhythmic thrum of those refineries provided the vast majority of the fuel required to keep Hitler's tanks rolling across the jagged eastern front and his fighter planes patrolling the contested European skies. Allied strategists recognized that these iron structures were the essential root of enemy power. Severing this source would ensure that the mechanized strength of the Third Reich would inevitably grind to a halt. Such a realization led to one of the most daring and controversial aerial operations in the history of warfare, a mission that demanded an entirely new approach to strategic bombing. Genesis for this plan took shape during high-level meetings between world leaders. In January of 1943, Winston Churchill endured a freezing, dangerous flight across the Atlantic to meet Franklin Roosevelt in Casablanca. Amid the luxury of Moroccan villas, they agreed that Ploesti must be destroyed, regardless of the cost. Responsibility for designing this strike fell to a young, intelligent officer named Jacob Smart. He realized that traditional high-altitude bombing, the standard doctrine of the American Air Forces, required a massive fleet of aircraft that simply does not exist in the Mediterranean theater. To achieve the necessary precision with only 200 bombers, Smart proposed a radical departure from established practice. These planes would not attack from 30,000 feet. Instead, they would roar in at treetop level. Meanwhile, this low-altitude approach offered the possibility of surprise and accuracy, yet it placed the heavy 4-engine B-24 Liberator in a role for which it was never intended. Crews often described the aircraft as a flying boxcar or an aluminum cigar, a fast and long-range machine that lacked the grace of its counterparts. Its thin, narrow wings provided excellent lift at high altitudes, but made the ship incredibly vulnerable to any structural damage. Moving through the air with a certain clumsiness, the B-24 required immense physical strength from its pilots to maintain tight formations. Despite these drawbacks, it remained the only weapon available with the range to reach Romania from the African coast and return. Leadership of this mission was as varied and complex as the plan itself. Major General Louis Brereton, a pugnacious and assertive commander known as Hotfoot Louis, took responsibility for the 9th Air Force. He was a man of action who had risen through the ranks despite a checkered earlier career and a public struggle with the psychological pressures of flying. Under him served Brigadier General Uzal Ent, a career officer and ordained minister, who maintained a deep skepticism about the low-level plan. Bombardment groups themselves were led by formidable personalities like John Riley Kane, a man whose aggressive nature and towering physical presence earned him the nickname Killer. Kane was a direct, outspoken Texan who regarded the planners in Washington with open contempt, yet he was fiercely dedicated to the survival of his men. Joining him were leaders like Leon Johnson of the 44th Group, a respected West Point graduate, and Addison Baker, a former auto mechanic who led the 93rd. By the early summer of 1943, 5 bombardment groups assembled in the Libyan desert near Benghazi. 3 of these groups arrived from the relatively comfortable bases of England, finding themselves thrust into a primitive and punishing environment. Desert winds acted as an unrelenting antagonist. Red sand as fine as dust penetrated every crevice of the tents, the food, and the machinery. It scoured the plexiglass windows of the bombers until they were opaque and invaded the delicate engines, forcing mechanics to rebuild them after only a few dozen hours of flight. Stultifying heat often reached over 120 degrees, turning the metal fuselages of the planes into ovens. Men lived on canned rations and bitter, chlorinated water, finding relief only in the cool waters of the Mediterranean, or the rare, frigid beer cooled during high-altitude test flights. Later that day, training for the mission became intense and unprecedented. For weeks, pilots were ordered to do what they were previously taught would get them dismissed from the service: fly as low as possible. They skimmed across the desert floor at 20 feet, kicking up dust and scattering the livestock of local nomads. This low-level work was exhilarating for some but terrifying for others, as there was no possibility of using a parachute if a plane was hit so close to the ground. To prepare the crews for the specific layout of the target, engineers constructed a full-scale replica of the Ploesti refineries in the sand using lime and oil drums. Men spent hours studying detailed maps and oblique drawings that show exactly how the buildings would appear from a low angle. They even watched a secret training film that used a child's tricycle as a camera dolly to simulate the approach to the target. As the launch date of August 1st approached, the air of secrecy thickened, bases were sealed off, and the target was finally revealed to the crews. Name of Ploesti brought a mixture of excitement and dread. Despite the optimistic briefings and a propaganda film that downplayed the German defenses, many experienced airmen suspect they were being sent on a suicide mission. Night before the raid was marked by a somber atmosphere. A special steak dinner felt to many like a final meal for the condemned. Men visited chaplains, wrote farewell letters to their families, and gave away their personal belongings. Killer Kane, convinced he would not return, spent the night staring at the stars, reflecting on the far-reaching effects of their sacrifice. Morning of the mission began in a reddish glare of swirling dust. 177 Liberators, overloaded with extra fuel tanks and thousands of pounds of bombs, struggled to get airborne from the sandy runways. Takeoff was a desperate labor, with the planes weighing at the absolute limit of their structural capacity. One bomber crashed and exploded almost immediately, a dark omen that the crews watched from the air. Once in formation, the massive armada stretched for 5 miles across the sky, heading out over the blue Mediterranean. Early hours of the flight were a test of endurance and navigation. Mechanical failures began to take a toll, forcing several planes to turn back. Near the island of Corfu, the lead plane of the entire formation suddenly plunged into the sea without warning, leaving the remaining crews shaken as they maintained radio silence. As a result, the first major irreversible turning point occurred as the force reached the Pindus Mountains. A wall of towering white clouds forced the groups to climb to nearly 17,000 feet. In the chaos of navigating the weather, the formation became fatally fragmented. Forward groups, moving at a faster power setting, pulled ahead and lost visual contact with the formations following them. Two halves of the mission were now separated by 60 miles, and the synchronized massed arrival that was central to Jacob Smart's plan was shattered. Germans, having intercepted American radio codes, were already fully aware of the approaching force. As the bombers descended toward the Danube River and the Romanian plains, the element of surprise was gone, and the 5 groups were no longer a single unified strike force. They moved forward into a meticulously prepared trap, and the original status quo of the mission had vanished forever. Before we move on, please subscribe to our channel, Operation Zero. Don't forget to hit like and share this with fellow audio documentary enthusiasts, especially those who love military history. Let's continue. As fragmented formations descend toward the shimmering ribbon of the Danube River, pilots push their heavy control columns forward, bringing massive B-24s down until they are skimming only a few dozen feet above the fertile Romanian soil. Jarring and immediate, the transition from the frigid, thin air of the high mountains to the oppressive heat of the lowlands hits the crews like a physical blow. Below them, a pastoral landscape of Europe passes in a blur of green and gold, a peaceful scene about to be shattered. Farmers in the fields drop their tools and dive for cover as shadows of nearly 200 bombers race across the ground, while the roar of 800 engines vibrates the very earth. Air crews, peering out from their cramped, oil-slick stations, see surprised faces of villagers and sudden, frantic movements of terrified livestock. Flying at this altitude, the mission feels less like a strategic bombing run and more like a high-speed obstacle course, where slightest errors in judgment or sudden mechanical failures mean certain death against rolling hills or sturdy branches of an oak grove. Inside the lead aircraft, Teggy Ann, Major General Ent, and Colonel Compton monitor their progress with increasing anxiety that knots in their stomachs. Success of this plan relies on reaching specific navigational checkpoints to ensure the entire force hits the refineries simultaneously from different directions. However, losing the lead navigator earlier in the flight now begins to manifest as a catastrophic error. As a result, as they approach the town of Pitesti, which serves as the final turning point before the target, a fatal misidentification occurs. Leading aircraft, followed closely by the 93rd Group under Addison Baker, turns prematurely to the southeast. Instead of heading toward the industrial outskirts of Ploesti, they are now racing directly toward the heavily defended capital of Bucharest. Behind them, leaders of the trailing groups, John Kane and Leon Johnson, recognize the mistake with growing horror, their hearts hammering against their ribs. Maintaining the correct course toward the north, they watch as the unified strike becomes irrevocably splintered. Splintered groups are no longer providing each other with mutual protection of their combined firepower, and the carefully timed sequence of the attack lies in ruins. Meanwhile, on the ground, German Defensive Commander General Alfred Gerstenberg watches the unfolding situation with cold, professional satisfaction, his stopwatch ticking with lethal precision. For months, he has transformed Ploesti into the most heavily defended target in all of Europe, creating a dense belt of anti-aircraft batteries that he calls his Ring of Fire. Integration of hundreds of heavy 88mm guns with smaller, rapid-fire cannons has been his obsession, concealing them in haystacks, false barns, and even on specially designed flak trains that can move along the perimeter to meet any threat. Radar stations and listening posts have tracked the American force since they crossed the Mediterranean, and his fighter pilots are already sitting in their cockpits, engines idling, waiting for the order to intercept. Young Americans believe they are bringing surprise to Ploesti, but Gerstenberg has been expecting them for hours, and he has prepared a reception that defies their wildest imaginations. 93rd Group Airmen, realizing the navigational error as they approach the outskirts of Bucharest, make a desperate sharp turn back toward Ploesti. This maneuver brings them into the target area from an unplanned direction, forcing them to fly across the path of oncoming groups and directly through the heart of the German defenses. Addison Baker, piloting the lead plane of the 93rd, finds himself staring into a wall of tracer fire and exploding shells. He was an auto mechanic once, a man who knew how to coax life out of a stubborn engine, and now he fights the controls of a machine that is literally falling apart in his hands. Aircraft is hit repeatedly, the nose section shredded and a wing set ablaze. Despite the damage and the certainty of an impending crash, Baker refuses to jettison his bombs or break formation. Understanding that if he falters, the pilots following him will lose their way in the chaos, he grits his teeth against the heat. Course is maintained until the very last moment, leading his men over the target before his shattered bomber finally wings over and plunges into the ground, leaving no survivors. Sacrifice allows his group to drop their ordnance on the assigned refineries, but the cost is a devastating loss of planes and lives. Later that day, John Kane and Leon Johnson bring their groups, the 98th and the 44th, toward the massive Astra Romana refinery. Approaching the target, they see that earlier, unplanned strikes have already turned the area into a hellscape of black smoke and towering pillars of orange flame. Low-level approach, designed to provide accuracy, now forces pilots to fly directly through infernos created by preceding bombs. Intense heat blisters the paint on fuselages and singes the hair of waist gunners who are screaming over the intercoms. Time-delayed bombs dropped by earlier groups begin to explode beneath trailing aircraft, tossing multi-ton bombers around like leaves in a gale. Kane, a man who has always led from the front, navigates his plane through a forest of tall smokestacks, some of which are being blown apart by the very bombs his group is delivering. Air is filled with a dense, oily soot that coats windscreens like greasy fingers, forcing pilots to fly by instinct and the brief glimpses they can catch through side windows. German defenses reach a fever pitch as the bombers move through the refinery complex. Hidden batteries along the railroad tracks open fire at point-blank range, their shells tearing through thin aluminum skins of the Liberators. One of the most terrifying innovations Gerstenberg has deployed is the flak train, a locomotive pulling flat cars loaded with anti-aircraft guns. As the bombers parallel the tracks, the train matches their speed, pouring a continuous stream of fire into vulnerable bellies of the aircraft. Several B-24s are hit in their open bomb bays, the resulting explosions vaporizing planes instantly. Others, with engines shot away or control cables severed, struggle to maintain altitude, while pilots fight a losing battle to keep from crashing into storage tanks and distillation towers they are trying to destroy. Chaos and noise create a deafening cacophony of roaring engines, exploding shells, and the rhythmic thud of the bomber's own machine guns, as waist gunners duel with German crews on the ground. Amidst this carnage, individual acts of desperate bravery define the character of the mission. Leon Johnson, a West Point graduate who carries the weight of his academy ring like a sacred duty, leads his group into a target that is already a sea of fire, knowing chances of survival are nearly non-existent. Pushing his aircraft through smoke so thick that he cannot see his own wingtips, he relies on brief flashes of refinery buildings to guide his aim. Plane is riddled with holes, and several crew members are wounded, yet he completes his run and manages to pull his battered ship away from the inferno. In another part of the sky, a pilot named Robert Sternfels navigates his bomber, the Sandman, through a gap between two burning tanks, the heat so fierce that the crew can feel their skin tightening against their skulls. Automatic camera in a nearby plane captures the iconic image of his aircraft emerging from black smoke, a fragile silhouette of American resolve against the backdrop of total war. As the bombers finally clear the target area and begin to turn away from the smoldering ruins of Ploesti, immediate threat from ground fire begins to recede, but a new and equally deadly peril emerges. German and Romanian fighter squadrons, having waited for the bombers to exit flak zones, now dive from the clouds to pick off the stragglers. B-24s are no longer in tight defensive formations that are their only protection against agile fighters. Many fly on 2 or 3 engines, their fuel tanks leaking and ammunition nearly exhausted. Running battle of the retreat stretches for hundreds of miles across the Balkans, German pilots, flying Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, focused their attacks on the most heavily damaged planes, hovering like wolves around wounded animals. Exhausted American gunners, often tending to bleeding comrades, fight back with grim determination, knowing every mile they cover brings them closer to the relative safety of the sea. Stark realization of the mission's true cost begins to settle over surviving crews as they count missing planes in their formations. Scattered clusters of aircraft now populate a sky once filled with the massed power of 5 bombardment groups. Feelings of triumph at having hit the targets are overshadowed by sheer scale of the losses. Men who had shared breakfast and jokes only hours before are gone, their planes having vanished in balls of fire over refineries or crashed in rugged mountains of Yugoslavia. Both physical and emotional exhaustion is overwhelming, yet pilots must remain alert, nursing crippled machines toward distant sanctuaries. Some planes are so badly damaged that they cannot hope to make the long journey back to Libya, and pilots begin to look for alternatives, whether a risky landing in neutral Turkey or a desperate attempt to reach the island of Cyprus. Such a retreat marks the final pre-climax turning point, as the mission shifts from an offensive strike to a desperate struggle for collective and individual survival. Original objective has been completed at a price that exceeds almost any other air operation in the war, and shattered remains of the force must now navigate a gauntlet of enemy fighters and mechanical failures. Brotherhood between the men is tested to its breaking point, as they decide whether to stay with faltering wingmen or prioritize their own dwindling fuel supplies. Majestic and broken, the armada that had set out with such high hopes and rigorous preparation is now a collection of haunted survivors, each crew alone in their fight to reach the horizon. Account of the attack on Ploesti is no longer about destruction of oil. It has become a narrative of how many men can be salvaged from the fire they have just walked through. Before we move on, please subscribe to our channel, Operation Zero. Don't forget to hit like and share this with fellow audio documentary enthusiasts, especially those who love military history. Let's continue. Frantic violence of the skies over Romania gradually yields to a heavy, agonizing silence as surviving bombers of Operation Tidal Wave distance themselves from towering black pyres of the refineries. Inside rattling fuselages, the mission has transitioned from a tactical strike into a grueling marathon of endurance, where primary adversaries are no longer German flak, but dwindling numbers on fuel gauges and catastrophic mechanical failures of battered machines. Meanwhile, the journey across Balkan mountain ranges and back toward the African coast feels incredibly lonely, as cohesive formations of the morning have dissolved into scattered, solitary aircraft struggling to maintain altitude. Every ounce of remaining strength is concentrated by pilots who, only hours ago, were focused on precision bombing. Now, they nurse wounded engines and fight to keep their crippled ships level. Beneath metal skins, interiors of many planes have become makeshift infirmaries, where uninjured crewmen use limited first aid kits to stem the bleeding of comrades hit by shell fragments during that low-level run. As afternoon sun begins to dip toward the horizon, the Mediterranean Sea offers a vast and indifferent expanse beneath wings of the retreating force. Certain aircraft are so severely damaged that they cannot hope to reach desert airfields of Libya. Consequently, these pilots face a harrowing choice between attempting a perilous water landing or heading toward neutral territory of Turkey. For those who choose the latter, experience is bittersweet. They escape immediate threats of fire and German capture, but find themselves in turn for the remainder of the conflict, watching the horizon for news of their brothers. Other crews are less fortunate, their engines seizing or fuel tanks running dry over open sea. Search and rescue efforts launched from the coast of North Africa scan waves for yellow glints of life rafts, yet reality of the mission's cost becomes increasingly apparent as expected arrival times pass, with many planes still missing. In the wake of the firestorm at Ploesti, focus shifts toward men who did not escape that ring of fire. Throughout charred ruins of refineries and surrounding Romanian countryside, hundreds of American airmen find themselves on the ground, either as casualties of crashes or as dazed survivors of successful bailouts. These men are quickly rounded up by Romanian soldiers and German patrols, entering a period of captivity marked by a surprising degree of humanity amidst broader brutality of war. Wounded men are taken to hospitals where they receive care, often as good as that provided to the local population, despite scarcity of medical supplies. Central to this chapter is Princess Catherine Karaja, a Romanian aristocrat who becomes a guardian angel for captured Americans. Having spent much of her youth in England, she speaks fluent English and feels a deep cultural affinity for airmen who had just attempted to destroy her country's most valuable resource. Frequently, she visits hospitals and prison camps, bringing food, comfort, and a sense of dignity to men who feel defeated and forgotten. Presence like hers provides a vital buffer against more severe intentions of German authorities, and she treats young pilots not as enemies, but as boys from the sky caught in a tragedy far larger than themselves. Back at desert bases near Benghazi, atmosphere is one of profound mourning and grim assessment. As sun sets on August 1st, empty parking spots on sandy airfields serve as a silent tally of the day's losses. Of 177 aircraft that took off, only a fraction returned to their original runways, and many of those are so riddled with holes they will never fly again. Mess halls, usually filled with boisterous energy of young men, are quiet as survivors look at unoccupied chairs of their friends. Intelligence officers begin the grueling task of debriefing exhausted crews, trying to piece together a coherent picture of damage inflicted. Initial reports are optimistic, fueled by vivid memories of massive explosions and walls of fire. However, as aerial reconnaissance photographs are analyzed in following days, a more sobering reality emerges. While several refineries sustained heavy damage, Germans proved to be masterfully efficient at repair and reconstruction. By utilizing hidden reserves and prioritizing restoration of critical distillation units, the enemy manages to bring oil production back to near pre-raid levels within weeks. Enormous sacrifice of these airmen has dealt a significant blow, but it has not achieved the knockout punch that planners in Washington and London had envisioned. Recognition of extraordinary bravery displayed during the mission comes quickly, as High Command realizes that regardless of strategic outcome, individual courage of the crews was unprecedented. 5 medals of honor are eventually awarded for the Ploesti raid, the highest number for any single air action in American history. John Kane and Leon Johnson are honored for their leadership and refusal to turn back from the inferno. Posthumous awards are given to Addison Baker and his co-pilot John Gerstad, as well as to Lloyd Hughes, a young pilot who flew his leaking, burning plane into the target to ensure bombs were delivered before he crashed. Formal acknowledgement of valor shown over Romania is a source of pride, yet for survivors, honors are a secondary concern compared to lingering trauma. Many men who return from Ploesti are haunted by sights and sounds of the low-level run, the smell of burning oil, and the sight of wingmen's planes disintegrating in the air. Physical and psychological tolls mean many are grounded for weeks or months, while others are rotated out of combat entirely, their spirits as battered as their aircraft. As a result, the narrative of Ploesti does not end with the return to Libya. It continues through long months of war as strategic focus on Romanian oil persists. In 1944, American air forces returned to the refineries, but this time they do so with overwhelming power of the 15th Air Force and traditional doctrine of high-altitude bombing. These subsequent raids, though less spectacular than the low-level strike of Operation Tidal Wave, eventually succeed where the first mission fell short. By launching wave after wave of bombers protected by long-range escort fighters, Allies are able to systematically dismantle industrial infrastructure of Ploesti. Lessons learned during that first tragic attempt, limitations of low-level heavy bombing and resilience of German defenses, are integrated into a more effective strategy of attrition. Refineries are finally silenced, and the German military machine begins to starve for fuel it needs to survive. Later that year, as the tide of war turns and the Soviet Red Army advances through the Balkans in late 1944, fate of American prisoners in Romania reaches a dramatic resolution. With the Romanian government switching sides and joining the Allies, American airmen are suddenly no longer captives but honored guests. In a daring operation known as Operation Reunion, a fleet of B-17 bombers is converted into passenger transports to fly survivors out of Bucharest and back to Italy. Men, many of whom have been protected and fed by Princess Karaja and the local population, are reunited with comrades in an emotional homecoming that marks final closure of their personal ordeal. They leave behind a country they had come to destroy, but which had, in the end, shown them a surprising degree of mercy. Legacy of the mission remains a subject of intense debate among historians and military strategists for decades. Some argue that the low-level plan was a fundamental mistake, a misuse of heavy bombers that resulted in an avoidable slaughter. Others maintain it was a necessary gamble, a bold attempt to end the war early by striking at the enemy's most vital artery. Regardless of strategic merits, the human story of Ploesti endures as a testament to capacity for courage under extreme circumstances. Men of the 5 bombardment groups proved they were willing to fly into the very heart of a firestorm for a cause they believed in, even when odds of survival were stacked heavily against them. History of aviation now holds the mission etched not just for technical audacity, but for individual stories of 1,900 men who crossed the Mediterranean that August morning. Eventually, passage of time turns burning refineries of Ploesti into a historical memory, and young men who piloted B-24s become aging veterans of a bygone era. They return to civilian lives, carrying invisible scars of the mission with them as they build families and careers in a world they help to save. Bond formed in desert heat and Romanian fire remains unbreakable, a shared understanding of a moment in time when lives were measured in seconds and feet. They remember the fallen not as names on a monument, but as vibrant, laughing friends who shared cramped quarters of the Liberators. Mission, with all its errors, tragedies, and moments of transcendent bravery, stands as a defining chapter in the narrative of World War II, a reminder of the terrible cost of victory and resilience of the human spirit when faced with the impossible. Story ends with quiet dignity of survivors who, in decades following the war, look back at the distant smudge of smoke on the horizon and recognize they were part of something that, for better or worse, changed the course of history forever.